we want to talk about the different aspects of GDP and why they tend to bounce around during recessions and expansions. So first we're going to look at consumption, since that's the biggest part of GDP in countries like the United States, like Europe, like Japan. Now, households would like to smooth consumption, right? They don't want to have to cut their spending by, a large amount if they lose their job, right? And so if we think about a lifetime, your income tends to go up as you get older, right? We find that as experience goes up, as education goes up, income tends to go up. And so when you're young, you're going to tend to borrow. You'll borrow for education, you'll borrow to buy cars, you'll borrow to buy a house. And then as you get older, you get higher income, you're going to repay the debt and eventually accumulate savings, hopefully in term for retirement. And then when you retire, you will hopefully have enough savings to spend and keep your consumption the same. And so if we look at this graph, we can see income is going up. Income is the blue line, right? It's low, it goes up, it falls during retirement, but consumption is smooth, at least once you start work. Now, that's not exactly true, right? We don't actually see perfectly smooth consumption from households, but we do see it be a lot more smoother than income is. So that's something to keep in mind. This is looking sort of at the long run rather than the short run. Most people don't plan to become unemployed, but they do try to have, something like a rainy day fund. Now, people are not always able to smooth as much as they want to, right? They might have credit constraints so that they can't borrow as much as they would like to. For instance, you can borrow for education, you can borrow to buy a house, you can borrow to buy a car, but you can't usually go to the bank and say, hey, I would just like to borrow in order to smooth my consumption without any collateral, right? The bank will say, no, I don't really trust you to pay it back, and so I'm not going to lend to you. Another issue is sort of weakness of will, right? The idea that this is sometimes called by the fancy name hyperbolic discounting, where you make a plan. You say, okay, I'm gonna save, and then I'm going to spend down that savings. But then today comes, and you're like, oh well, I'd really like to go buy that thing, right? And that's something we see very commonly in households. Another thing to keep in mind is that people tend to like to consume more than they did before. And so if income is going up as you get older and more experienced, then people will often plan to have their consumption go up as well, because that gives them higher utility rather than just smoothing consumption absolutely. So there are a number of reasons why households might not be as good at smoothing consumption as we might think. Now, investment is a little bit different. So one thing to keep in mind is that investment for a firm is not the same as consumption for a household. If a household loses income, they can't decide not to consume, right? If they decide not to consume, then they die. A firm can decide not to invest. In fact, if they decide not to invest, it just means that they're going to have slightly older capital. Depreciation might mean they have slightly less capital, but they will probably be able to survive, at least in the short run. So they might be able to survive for a year or 2 or 5 without investing. So if that's the case, then when do they decide to invest, right? Well, mostly it's going to depend on whether or not they think demand for their products is going to be high. If they think demand is going to be high, then they will invest, and that will often increase GDP growth. GDP growth means higher income for everybody. That means demand is high, and firms keep investing. And so there's often a virtuous circle in expansions, and especially in expansions that are driven by the adoption of a new technology. So if we think about the 1920s and then again in the 1940s as being driven by electricity and the electrification of different parts of the country, and then the expansion in the 1990s as being driven by the adoption of information technology, computers, we can see that there was definitely a virtuous circle, and those gave us some of the decades of strongest growth. But they don't have to invest, right? And so sometimes when they think, okay, well, demand's not going to be that high, investment can fall off very steeply. And so that's an important thing to remember, that consumption tends to go up and down a little bit, but investment tends to go up and down a lot during expansions and recessions. So here's a picture of investment in the Eurozone. So here, let's move myself over here. So we have both growth in nominal GDP, that's the blue line, growth in investment in new technologies, that's the red line, and then growth of the NASDAQ index. This is the US. This is from the 1990s to 2012. We have the European picture a little bit later. And what you can see is that nominal GDP growth tended to be pretty constant, right, until this recession in 2007 to 2009. But investment went up and down a lot. It was really high during the 90s. It fell in the 2000s, then it came back up. Then it fell again in this recession, and then it came back up, but not to a really high extent here. And so you can see that that was contributing a fair amount, as we already saw, to the recession of 2009 and also to the recession at the turn of the century. So if we think of investment, we can think of it kind of as a coordination game where firms will want to invest at the same time. And so it's kind of a best response to other firms' investment decisions. If firm A invests, firm B wants to invest too. If firm B doesn't invest, firm A doesn't want to invest either. And so that's going to mean that investment goes up during booms and falls during recessions. So if we look at the European situation in the last recession, the growth of investment here is in red on the left-hand axis, and it has fallen steeply. It fell steeply during the recession, and even more so than the growth of demand, which is the C plus G plus X minus M. And industrial confidence, the idea of how confident businesses are, fell along with it. Firms were like, no, I don't see a lot of demand. I don't want to invest. I'm nervous about the economy. And then it recovered to some extent, but then it fell again. And Europe has been, it took Europe longer sort of to recover from this last recession than the United States. Government spending tends to be less volatile than investment or even consumer spending, and often can be the stopgap. Now, in the United States, the federal government has much better ability to increase spending than do the state and local governments. For exports, that's going to depend a lot on what's going on in the other economies. So if the U.S. has a recession, that's going to hit Chinese producers, right? If the U.S. has a recession, that's going to hit Mexican and Canadian producers. And so it's always important to think about, all right, well, what's going on globally? And we'll talk about that towards the end of the semester.